up is David Bollier. He is an activist, scholar, and blogger who's focused on the commons as a new paradigm for reimagining economics, politics, and culture. He pursues his work as director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for a New Economics, and has co-founded the Commons Strategies Group, an international advocacy project. He has many books on this topic. Some of those are available in our bookstore, so you should get your hands on one or two. In 2012, Bollier received the Bosch Berlin Prize in Public Policy from the American Academy in Berlin and for his work on the Commons. I'll leave the rest to him. I welcome Mr. David Bollier.
A little known fact is that Claire and I briefly knew each other as undergraduates 40 years ago, and this is the first time I've seen her in 40 years. And she did a fantastic job unwittingly of sort of introducing some of the themes I want to talk about. First of all, let me thank Fred and the Land Institute for inviting me here. This is a great education for me as well, these two days. And I feel honored to be at a forum where so many illustrious activists and thinkers have been over the years. And I'd also like to give a hearty salute to Wes Jackson for his courage and vision and sheer persistence over the many years. So, now, I'm not a farmer. I don't really participate in the farm to table world except as a grateful eater, and I'm not a resident of the prairie, but I hope that some of the things I talk about will have some relevance nonetheless to the prairie. I come from Amherst, Massachusetts, a place of maple trees and Robert Frost and Emily Dickinson, and a quite lovely town common, and it's in that capacity that I want to come to you today. I want to talk to you about how the Commons really is a vehicle for social and political emancipation in reframing how we think about things. My new book, written, which is coming out next year with my German colleague Silke Helfrich, the title sort of captures some of the keynotes, which is free, fair, and alive. And free, not as in free, no cost, but free as in freedom, fair, and alive as sort of keynotes of a lot of things that goes on in the Commons. Because the Commons is really about lived experience, not ideology, and it's more about living systems that emerge from the bottom up rather than policies imposed from above. And I like the term that was used last night about growing creaturely crops. Well, I think we need to become creaturely people, and that's sort of what I see the Commons is all about. So I want to begin with a rather blunt and perhaps jarring statement that I think that we're embedded in a deep and serious war, a war against the imagination. And this phrase comes from the beat poet Diane de Prima, who an artist friend alerted me to, and she wrote a few lines that really struck me. She goes, "The war that matters is the war against the imagination. All the other wars are subsumed in it. The war is the war for the human imagination, and no one can fight it but you, and no one can fight it for you. The imagination is not only holy, it is precise. It is not only fierce, it is practical. Men die every day for the lack of it. It is vast and elegant. The ultimate famine," she said, "is the starvation of the imagination." And I realized how profoundly these kinds of lines speak to our current times, when there seems to be so little room in respectable circles for wide open dreaming and imagination and stepping off in new directions to explore the unknown. But I think as artists show us, it's the realm of the unknown that's precisely where we can really see and start to live. And in today's world, there are certain presumptions that serious people aren't supposed to question, such as the necessity of relentless growth and capital accumulation, the importance of strong consumer demand, and expansive private property rights. And the more of these we have, the better off we'll supposedly be. Well, I think that these dogmas have sucked the air out of public life and political culture, which is one reason that I've come to see the commons as a precious patch of ground that's an important staging area for developing an insurgency, for thinking and living our way past the prevailing orthodoxies. It's a space in which an insurgency can be launched, and indeed, if you can train yourself to see it, is already being launched. So in the next few minutes, I'd like to suggest how the commons paradigm can help us develop a new social and cultural vision and some new strategies for practical action. And paradoxically enough, I think that redirecting our attention away from conventional politics and policy may be the most promising way for developing a new vision for transformation. Because I think we're reaching a point of diminishing returns within the existing system. That real change and regeneration are going to require that somehow we jump the tracks and find new ways of going forward. And we need to start imagining different ways of being, doing, and knowing, and we need to invent new institutional structures that give support to that kind of a paradigm shift. Now, let me start to clarify what I mean by the commons, because this term is greatly misunderstood and abused. For most people, the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about the commons is the tragedy of the commons. And this idea really got into popular circulation when the biologist Garrett Hardin wrote a famous essay in 1968 in Science Journal called The Tragedy of the Commons. And he said, imagine you have a pasture in which farmers can put as many sheep on it as they want. The result, he said, will inevitably be the overexploitation of that pasture because no individual farmer will have a rational incentive to hold back. And so it will be overexploited and ruined. And this has been such a tidy, tenacious little smear that has existed for more than 2 generations because it's economists and conservatives and private property rights private property rights advocates have embraced the tragedy parable as a way to denigrate collective efforts to manage resources, especially via government. And it's really a way to celebrate private property rights and by implication, free markets and deregulation. But the problem that Hardin was describing is really just a fantasy because he wasn't describing a common. This has no empirical basis. He was describing essentially an open access regime or a free-for-all when anybody can take as much as they want without being concerned about the consequences. But a real commons has a community, has rules, has traditions and practices for how it's managed, has sanctions against those who are free riders or trespassers. And so it's a very different thing that we're talking about. Oddly enough, he was kind of describing standard economics where you're a rational, disconnected individual you're defined by your ability to maximize your utility in supposedly rational ways. And competition makes you a sucker if you don't take as much as you can. You might say he was describing the tragedy of the market. And it's this inversion that this is taken as a truism and drilled into every undergraduate's head over the years. Oh, the tragedy of the market, the tragedy of the commons. We know what that's all about. That's it. Well, it was the late Professor Eleanor Ostrom from Indiana University who powerfully rebutted the whole tragedy fable in her landmark 1990 book, Governing the Commons. She won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 for this work. It's the first woman to win this award, incidentally, and I like to think that it had something to do that as a woman she was more attentive to relationships than men in her field and saw that cooperation was actually economically consequential, something that the rest of the field has not really seen. And you might say, despite this prize, despite her work, why is the commons still ignored by economists? And it really comes down to the fact that when you're studying markets and cash exchange as the main event in life, if there's no market or cash exchange, well, it's just not very interesting. And yet, commons are everywhere, and they're the ancient heritage of humankind, of the human species. The International Land Coalition estimates that around the world, 2.5 billion people to this day depend upon fisheries, forests, farmlands, irrigation water, wild game, managed as commons in their everyday life. In other words, it's kind of a default mode of provisioning throughout the world. And yet, we moderns see the commons as mostly invisible. Or we misrepresent it as ineffectual and marginal and doomed to failure. So the huge achievement of Ostrom and her academic colleagues was to provide a scholarly validation for the commons as a system of governance and provisioning. And she showed that, as I mentioned, cooperation matters, something that most of her male colleagues scoffed at. And I might add, the economics profession has still, to this day, 9 years later, not really embraced her work that much. Now, meanwhile, what's really interesting is that on a separate track outside of academia for the past 20 years, a self-replicating movement of commoners has arisen to build an empire of their own. This has been an insurgent, diversified network of people based on the idea of commoning. Now, you have to understand the commons is not really a noun, it's a verb. It's a set of practices by which people come together, figure out the terms of their peer governance, they figure out how to devise fair systems, how to prevent rule breaking, how to build a collaborative culture, and so on. So you might say, well, who are these commoners around the world? Well, they, of course, consist of the traditional commoners, the farmers, the pastoralists, the fishers, the villagers who traditionally manage their various natural resources. But it also consists of a lot of localists who are trying to restore the self-determination of their communities through community land trusts and CSA farms and alternative currencies and alternative finance systems, among other things. There are Croatians fighting the enclosure of their coastal lands and public spaces. There are Greeks developing mutual aid systems to deal with the decimation of their country through neoliberal policies. There's a rich Francophone network of commoners and others in Spain and Italy and the UK and India who are self-identified and revolving a lot of work around the commons as they see many of the traditional systems like socialism and austerity politics failing them miserably. There's a new municipalism focused on cities in places like Amsterdam and Seoul and Bologna and Barcelona especially, where they're developing new commons-based forms of municipal governance of spaces, of facilities, of Wi-Fi systems, of controls on development. There's indigenous peoples, of course, who are bravely fighting to defend their ethnobotanical knowledge and their biocultural practices. And then there's a vast diversified network of digital commoners who are creating free and open source software and open access publishing journals. There's more than 10,000 these days. Platform cooperatives, which are our counterpoint to Airbnb and Uber type vehicles. Wikis and makerspaces and fab labs. So there's a whole set of things going on in these spaces which, again, are commons. Now, there's almost like a spontaneous convergence or a collective unconscious going on here where these different types of people in very different circumstances and different histories and different resources are using the commons as a lingua franca. Now, the one thing they have in common besides trying to create the world anew is their victimization by capital and markets. And this brings us to the term enclosure. Now, it's a term that really I find so useful because it helps commoners fight the war of imagination, the war against their imagination that economics and the standard political world is all about. Because enclosure names the harms that occur when the market state system privatizes and encloses our shared wealth. Enclosure happens when something managed by a social cohort or an ecosystem is ripped from its context, converted into private property, and sold. And then price becomes its value. And this is really an act of radical dispossession. It's the kind that defined the English enclosure movement in the 17th and 18th centuries, when millions of people, commoners, were evicted from their traditional lands, the forest and pastures and so forth, and forced basically to emigrate to cities and become the world that Charles Dickens wrote about and enter England's dark satanic mills. They were converted from commoners into paupers and wage slaves. And we're now in the midst of a second major enclosure movement, and this time it's using maybe less violent means, often but not always, but certainly more effective weapons. And these include things like intellectual property rights, digital technologies, big data and algorithms, and as needed, raw market power and state power. And as in the past, the mission is to seize the commonwealth for private profit making. Now, enclosure happens when the Hunt brothers buy up vast tracts of groundwater in the Midwest, turning precious repositories of life into speculative commodities to be sold to the highest bidders. And enclosure happens when the biotech world and the pharmaceutical companies patent genetic information of plants and seeds and medicines and diseases. 1/5 of the human genome is currently privately owned. And the German company BASF owns more than 6,000 patents governing genetic sequences in 862 marine organisms. I find that just appalling. Enclosure happens when industrial agriculture converts living landscapes into vast, semi-dead repositories of soil to grow monoculture crops. And it occurs when the traditional sharing and cultivating of seeds are criminalized, as is happening today. So amazingly, American politics and economics don't have a name for the idea of enclosure. Instead, it's called innovation or wealth creation or progress. And that's why I think the language of the Commons is so important, because it starts to help name these things and start to debunk some modern day fairy tales that go as conventional wisdom. Now, what does all this talk about the Commons have to do with rural America and farming and human well-being? Well, I'd like to propose that the Commons can help us break out of the claustrophobic mindset of contemporary politics and economics, especially as it affects rural America, because I think these concepts and scores of actual real-life projects open up new ways of thinking that get beyond the traditional progress narrative of growth and, quote, development. And as the era of climate change descends upon us, and as we begin to recognize the fragility and cost of supply chains for food, energy, and water, as we learn how the great corporations work with government to consolidate market power and squeeze out the little guys, and as we discover how markets tend to flatten the distinctiveness of place and identity and to propagate inequality and precarity and division, we're learning what I think the pre-moderns have known for millennia, which is that place-based stewardship and community and community self-reliance can often make for a far more ecologically rooted, humane, and satisfying way to live. And that's sort of a place we need to get back to. But how do we possibly work for this vision? One thing's for sure, it's not going to come through Washington or new trade policies or a new farm bill, much, at least not initially. But it will first require, I think, some deeper cultural and personal shifts from us, and the development of some new forms of commons-based institutions to support that perspective. It'll require that we move away from a mindset that is transactional, which is, of course, the essence of capitalist markets and a mindset that we've deeply internalized, and learn to embrace a mindset that is at its core relational, where we see ourselves as interconnected and interdependent, and we can actually have the capacity to show our vulnerabilities and have those vulnerabilities respected and met. And that's where I see the Commons as helping to catalyze a transformation, because the language and framing of the Commons helps us name this different order of life, which is otherwise scattered or invisible or denigrated as civil society. And it helps us, I think, move beyond the misleading narrative of standard economics. Evolutionary scientists are showing us that the whole idea of the hyper-individualism in the story of our modern times is just an utter fantasy. If you talk to E.O. Wilson or David Sloan Wilson, two eminent evolutionary scientists, they've shown that the human species has evolved through cooperation. And we're not free-floating individuals without histories or social ties or untouched by geography or community we're defined by our social relationality, and not our separation from nature. So in reality, I like to call ourselves nestedized. We're not individuals, we're nestedized because we're nested within these larger biological and social webs that profoundly shape us. And land and natural systems are not mere resources. They're something that we have an affection and connection with, and that's why I like to call a lot of these so-called resources, as economists call it, care wealth. And care wealth is not something you define by price, that's a category error. So it's these relationships that need to be brought to the foreground. I always remember this thrilling quote from Thomas Berry where he says, "The universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects." And this is what, if you'll excuse the term, the ontological shift we need to make, or the onto shift, that we need to, as a culture and personally, to, first of all, recognize, and then find ways through our projects and practices and language to really move out. In other words, not just sort of an intellectual seminar room thing or private reading. We need to actualize this socially. So in a sense, I see that's what the commons is all about. It's really, the commons is a rediscovered term that really describes some very ancient realities. The connection to the cosmos and to the land that the indigenous people have. It really, the commons expresses the land ethic that Aldo Leopold wrote about. It echoes what Rachel Carson said about the whole interconnectedness of all living things. And of course, what Wendell Berry has written so beautifully about the human satisfactions of living and working with a landscape. So the commons also helps us bring to the fore all these values that, again, sort of drift off into the ether about how entitlement and responsibility need to be yoked together, how we need long-term stewardship, how we need bottom-up governance and rules, not just top-down things, how we need to talk about inalienability. Certain things are not for sale. This is another thing we need to bring to the fore. And about how fairness and participation and inclusiveness are critical elements of our governance regimes. And for me, it all gets back to relationality. And here's where we need to start to grow a new vision, as opposed to transactions among individuals who are all separated. So, much has been made about the links between Trump voters and rural America, and I think that linkage has been really overblown. I think Trump brilliantly has exploited genuine needs and preyed upon fears and desperation. But if we think more deeply about what's important to all of us long term, and about what makes for quality of life, I think the answers won't be ideological, they'll be human. And that's where they'll be human, and then we need to be able to build out the new legal and economic and institutional vessels for that different sensibility. So this is an unfolding that we need to make happen. The standard wisdom is that the farmers and agricultural suppliers and rural businesses need to double down and compete more effectively and get smarter, meaner, leaner, and that's how we're going to prevail. There may be a need for government subsidies and different forms of support, and I think all of those arguments are fair enough so far as they go. But we've seen that this approach is fraught with a lot of problematic long-term risks. Are we really prepared to accept permanent subordination to the corporate seed and biotech and chemical giants? Do we really want to build a future based on volatile energy and food prices in an era of peak oil and climate change? Can we really depend on dwindling supplies of water from elsewhere and maybe owned by someone else, and on the shifting sands of international trade and trade policies and tariffs? I'd like to suggest that a more constructive and secure long-term vision is for communities to become more locally autonomous and self-directed, to become less dependent on global and national markets, which in many cases treat rural America as a site of neocolonial extraction in any case. So the more pressing or promising answers, I think, are going to be with greater relocalization and community self-reliance in decommodifying our daily needs more than they are now, in working with the land and not abusing it, in developing shared infrastructure and collaborations with other commoners, and in mutualizing the benefits that are generated from all of this process. And I think that was roughly the strategy that the civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer had about 50 years ago when she purchased about 680 acres in the Mississippi Delta region and then named them Freedom Farms. And the goal was to provide access to land so that African Americans could grow food cooperatively. And she said, when you've got 400 quarts of greens and gumbo soup canned for the winter, nobody can push you around and tell you what to say or do. And I think that, that's the basic ethic of the commons, is we can have the freedom that nobody can push us around or tell us what we can say or do. And I think that really that's the beauty of the commons, that it's practical. You could say that it draws upon the best of all political ideologies. Conservatives ought to like it because the tendency of the commons is to promote responsibility. Liberals are pleased with it because there's a focus on equality and basic social entitlement. Libertarians like the emphasis on individual initiative, and leftists like the idea of limiting the scope of markets. So it's all about cultivating this mindset of mutual support and building durable, practical systems of relationality. So in the few minutes that remain, I'd like to quickly review some of the cooperative benefit sharing approaches that especially have relevance in rural and farming contexts. I mean, I suppose it seems natural to start with the Land Institute's Kernza wheat and other perennial crops. It's really hard to imagine an agricultural innovation more in sync with natural systems in terms of using less water than conventional wheat and preventing water runoff and erosion and capturing more carbon and providing more year-round habitat for wildlife, while of course providing a tasty food for we humans. I think it has enormous potential for developing a more regenerative relationship with the land itself and enhancing a sense, there's got to have important spin-off effects for the stability of agricultural communities. I'm thrilled by another commons in the making, the open source seed initiative, where the basic purpose is to decommodify seeds and make them freely breedable and shareable under terms set by the commoners themselves. Currently, there's more than 400 varieties of seeds and 51 species that have become what I would call relationalized property. And these are legally shareable seeds that can participate in the gift economy of nature, but there's not the threat of privatization. So of course, land is another precious resource that has already been enclosed by capital or faces constant threats of enclosure by capital. And so really the challenge is, how can land be made more affordable and accessible, especially for young farmers, and be deployed as an object of stewardship and not just ruthless market exploitation. And we know how community land trusts are a powerful vehicle for this sort of land reform. And there's ways, this is a way for commoners and communities to take land off the market and use it for long-term community purposes, such as affordable housing, town improvements, sustainable agricultural and recreation. But again, it comes back to the strategy of decommodify and share. a community land trust is a kind of commons because it socializes and collectivizes the economic rent in a self-organized way, and then reinvests it back into the community that helped create it. So in a way you could say it's a social organism for regenerating value through democratic governance and open membership. More recently, the Schumacher Center, which I work with, has been developing an offshoot of community-supported agriculture called community-supported industry. And the idea is to use many of the same legal structures but with some twist, to help decommodify land and buildings that can be then used for import replacement, meaning production, retail, and food that again allows the recirculation of money and community connection within a region. So in terms of repurposing land for more collectively beneficial purposes, I recently learned about the so-called Faithlands movement, which is a small but growing movement of churches and monasteries and different religious orders that are it turns out that a lot of these people have lots of land that is held in tax-free lands, tax-free ways, much as conservation orders or land trusts do. And so they're often creating new community-spirited uses of this land. I was struck by a quote from a farmer who was working on church land who said, our scripture starts with Genesis in the garden and ends with Revelation in a garden in the city, with Jesus in the middle inviting us to a meal. If we're seeking to transform our land system in a way that's going to be beneficial, not only for ourselves, but for our great-grandchildren, how can the church put its land into service? So simply asking, what does the land want? How can we feed the hungry? It lets us consider the idea of food itself as a commons. Why shouldn't food be recognized as a basic human need available to us all, if only as biological beings, and not merely as a private transnational commodity? And I think just raising this question is provocative and useful, even if we don't know the answer right now, much as this famous essay on the Buffalo Commons in 1998, which called for returning a vast portion of the Great Plains to native prairie. Well, that never happened, of course, but it provoked some very useful conversations and helped reorient people's thinking in ways that catalyzed some really interesting projects that move parts of the prairie towards the commons. So if a larger commons sector is going to arise and flourish, however, we're going to need more than small-scale one-off projects. We're going to need shared infrastructure that can take things to the next level. This can open up new opportunities for commoning while thwarting or minimizing the possibility of business monopolies and proprietary lock-ins, such as proprietary seeds and exclusive supply chains and the like. I'm really thrilled to learn of a number of experiments in this regard of shared infrastructure created by farmers. In the area north of Boston, along the seacoast of Massachusetts and New Hampshire and Maine, the Three River Farmers Alliance has brought together a variety of local producers to aggregate their produce and distribute their foods. And the shared distribution system helps them escape a dependency on the powerful middlemen and build their new independent distribution and bonds of cooperation among themselves. And critical to this is an open farm management software platform that allows each farm to work independently, but they can opt in to cooperate with each other, share knowledge, and other coordination together. And this works only because there's a shared set of data protocols managed as a commons. Again, a kind of shared infrastructure. Another example I think of is the Fresno Commons in California, which is reinventing the whole farm-to-table supply chain under the control of a series of community trusts. And so you have the farmers, the distributors, the retailers, the supermarkets, mutualizing risks and benefits throughout the value chain. And so the profit doesn't get siphoned away to the investors, It's allowed to improve wages and working conditions, to grow food without pesticides, and to make food more affordable to low-income people and so forth. So these stories, for me, point to the critical role of digital network technologies in bringing some of the advantages of the Googles and Twitters and so forth to a local scale. But this is not just about the efficiencies that come from that and the automated administration. It's about really a new tech-based affordances or a platform for cooperation, which has its own cultural ramifications. Another platform that I think can help in this regard is what is sometimes referred to as cosmo-local production. Now, this is an emerging platform where the knowledge and design, the lightweight stuff, is shared globally among various partners on the internet, but then the heavy physical tasks of local production are done locally in open source ways, which is to say inexpensive, modular, locally sourceable, and protected from enclosure. And this is the idea behind, for example, the Farm Hack project, which is basically a global community of open source designers of all sorts of farm equipment that can be then produced. Cosmo local production is currently being used to design electronics, video animation, houses, furniture, there's even a WikiSpeed car. So this same general logic of global collaboration can be seen in, some of you may be familiar with the System for Rice Intensification, which is this collaborative global effort of farmers, especially in poorer countries, to trade insights and guidance on agronomy techniques for rice. And this has improved rice yields by 3, 4, 5 times without GMOs and pesticides. So I've been talking a lot of things which might be construed of as policy, but I want to get back to a theme that was touched on by Claire, and which I feel very much being here, which is the importance of art and culture in this process. Because we're talking about our whole selves, we're talking about our relationships with each other and the land, and our identities, and art and culture are the natural vehicles for speaking this. So I don't want us to suggest that this is simply a white paper policy driven or political thing. This is about engaging the whole spirit, or as I heard earlier, the eco spirit, of which art and culture have so much to say. I think you can begin to connect some of the dots that I've been trying to lay out here. No single one of them is going to be the answer, but I think taken together, they can help us begin to think and feel and be commoners. And that's really liberating. And I think it opens up all sorts of vistas of possibilities that otherwise might not be available to us. And it begins to help us fight the war against the imagination and give us some hope. In the 1980s, Prime Minister Thatcher in the UK famously defended the neoliberal agenda of privatization and deregulation and fiscal austerity with a line that was often shortened to the acronym TINA, T-I-N-A. There is no alternative, she would thunder, and she just repeatedly did this. Well, in truth, as I've come to see over the past 10 or 15 years, the real acronym we should be using is TAPAS, T-A-P-A-S. There are plenty of alternatives. But these alternatives are only available to us if we can learn how to develop a new mindset, cultivate a new language to express a shared vision, and then embark upon the hard work of building it through commoning project by project. And that's, I think, the real challenge we face, which I'm really grateful to be able to share with this remarkable Prairie Festival today. So thank you.
We have... We have time for some questions for So we'll start with this first hand that I saw over here.
Hi, Amy Elder from Northfield School. And
Oh, hi.
I want you to come to my house very soon. I would like to ask you, are you considering the small liberal arts college as a commons? That's what I'm doing now.
I think academia more generally needs to rediscover its roots as a commons as opposed to a top-down administrated, credential-driven process. You want to call in people?
Right here?
My name is Russell Fox. I teach at Friends University in Wichita, Kansas, and actually Northfield is right down the road from me, so I'm going to double up with an invitation. But I also have a question for you. You strongly emphasize the importance of cultural transformation, but you did inevitably talk a lot about policy, and it's kind of hard to avoid that. I was struck in particular by your data about how much of the human genome is basically, in the hands of corporations through patents. And I think about a single Supreme Court case back in the early 80s, Chakrabarti v. U.S., that basically opened the door for corporations and others, wealthy individuals, etc., to patent forms of life. We can't ever get away from the political fights. We can't ever get away from fighting over policy. How do you see yourself striking a balance between, on the one hand, saying, this is a cultural and ontological shift, but we also really have got to be fighting these political fights?
I think the answer is it's not an either-or proposition, it's both. But as someone who emerged in my 20s from Washington, I worked with Nader and many other groups in Washington, and I've re-engaged with them more recently. They have such a powerful set of pressures on them from funders, from their peer groups, from the whole milieu of Washington policy, that they basically have lost the institutional capacity to be transformative. They fight important battles. I'm so glad they're there, but I think the transformational logic is going to have to be coming from outside. And that's why I think the Commons is important for developing a sovereign vision with a sense of self-confidence and integrity of that vision. I mean, I've had friends from major environmental groups in Washington saying, I love the Commons, I love what you're talking about. We can't use it. Our funders won't give any money for it. The people in Congress won't know what the hell we're talking about. So I think there's a difficulty in integrating it. And I think, so yes, we need those battles. We need to fight policy. Those are important arenas. But no, they're not going to be transformative, at least in the short term.
Oh, over here, yellow.
I think on that, you call Prime Minister Robin Hood. He just said a lot of work to be in our own.
I'm sorry?
Did you hear him? We're back to Robin Hood, and we just need to go back to the woods and be alone.
Well, the question was about we were going back to Robin Hood.
And going to the woods alone.
Going to the woods alone. Well, I think that there is a certain provisional retreat that's necessary to keep keep a focus on our values and concerns and vision and to develop them. And it's funny you mentioned Robin Hood because many of you may not realize that there is a history going back to the Magna Carta and the much neglected Charter of the Forest, which guaranteed commoners' rights of access to the means of subsistence, which is arguably more legal entitlement than we have today. And of course, the Charter of the Forest has been largely forgotten and subsumed into something that is celebrated as a victory for state law and not for commoners' rights.
We have maybe two more. Here and there.
What's the role of comedies in helping us break out of the wage economy? And what's the power of new currencies to do that?
Whoa, fantastic. The question was, what's the difference, what's the role of the commons in breaking out of the wage economy and the role of alternative currencies? The commons is basically either precedes the wage economy and has often been coercively snuffed out by the circuits of money and economy. I recently read the book Ramp Hollow about Appalachia, which is precisely about that. Or trying to recover it by decommodifying ourselves, which is probably the biggest threat to the conventional economy. Look how the tech world responded when Linux first emerged, or open source software, apoplectic, communism, and so forth. They eventually found a way to monetize it and use it as a free input. But the point is, the commons helps us develop a certain alternative space with greater freedom than the market system typically allows. Alternative currencies, the blockchain is not going to be the answer, at least in terms of Bitcoin, but the technology can allow for new forms of cooperative value sharing within a community without government or banks. So there's enormous possibilities there, but it all comes in down to implementation and the social culture for managing it.
Thank you. Last question?
Yeah. I was just wondering, so economic history, writers like Carl Poland and others connected culture and economics, and I'm just wondering how that got lost and how we can fight the war of ideas that changes, especially because markets are all about it.
Well, I would love for that debate to occur more generally. The American political culture has... Oh, I'm sorry. The question was how we can get the sense of, or the sense of social, how would you phrase it? I've forgotten your exact wording. How to create culture and economics again, and how do we engage in this battle of ideas? I mean, I think that is the challenge. We don't have many conventional vehicles, or certainly the political parties or the media are not going to be taking us there. I think that this is going to have to be asserted from the bottom up. It's one reason why I see the commons as a language and vessel for starting to have precisely these conversations, because even my progressive economist friends are locked into the Keynesian worldview or economic categories and don't see economics as something that's socially embedded the way Karl Polanyi did in his book, The Great Transformation. So, I mean, that's the struggle. I wish I had an easy answer. I see the commons as a form of practice, as a way of enacting it and asserting it, but we have a lot of work to do.